The slap landed with such unexpected force that my glasses flew off my face, shattering across the glossy marble of the ballroom floor. A sharp sting lit up my cheek, but the burn inside my chest, raw, bewildered, humiliated, was far worse. For a moment, there was no music, no murmurs, no footsteps, just silence. 130 wedding guests stood frozen in place, their eyes wide, champagne flutes dangling mid-air. The echo of skin meeting skin was still hanging in the air like a thunderclap. No one knew how to process. Juliet, my daughter-in-law now, apparently stood in front of me, in her pristine white wedding gown, still breathing hard, her hand trembling slightly. "That's what you get for being so selfish," she hissed, her voice shrill and loud enough to ricochet off the crystal chandeliers above us. "A woman your age doesn't need so much space." I stood there, dumbfounded. Her words felt like another slap. Then I heard it, low murmurs, shoes shifting on the marble, a few gasps muffled behind manicured fingers. The heat of shame rushed to my face as I crouched to pick up the pieces of my shattered glasses, my hands trembling. No one moved to help me, not one guest. I didn't look up. I couldn't. But I knew some were pretending not to watch. Others whispered behind hands, all too eager to repeat the scandal over dessert. And my son, Ethan, my only child, stood there, mute, his head down, his hands limp at his sides. His new wife had just assaulted his mother in front of a crowd, and he didn't so much as flinch. "You're not welcome here anymore," Juliet continued, smoothing the lace on her dress like she hadn't just detonated a grenade in front of everyone. "Ethan and I need our privacy to start our new life. Your apartment would be perfect for us while we look for something more appropriate." Her voice was pure venom wrapped in silk. For months, she had chipped away at my dignity, snide comments about my clothes, my car, my job. But this was the final blow. It wasn't just a slap. It was the erasure of everything I had been to them. The dismissal of a life lived quietly, respectfully. And in that moment, as I slowly stood up, glass fragments crunching under my shoes, I knew something inside me had snapped. The silence didn't hurt as much as Ethan's stillness. He had always been my boy, tender, observant, protective. But today, he stood by the woman who had just physically assaulted me and said nothing. Didn't move, didn't blink. I turned away, walking slowly toward the exit. My heart beat in my ears like a war drum. The room blurred behind unshed tears, but I didn't let them fall, not yet. As I reached the grand doorway, I overheard the whispers like knives in my back. "She looks so fragile," said one woman, Juliet's aunt. "Maybe. The bride is right. That woman can't take care of herself anymore," someone else murmured. "Shouldn't she be in assisted living?" I gripped the edge of the doorway for a second. I had spent decades of my life living quietly, unassumingly. People thought I was just a widow on a fixed income, clinging to her rent-controlled apartment and a part-time job at a flower shop. My name is Aurora Hughes. I'm 68 years old. And up until that moment, I had let the world believe I was small, harmless, invisible. But they didn't know what I had kept hidden. My husband, Robert, whom everyone assumed was a middle-tier office worker, had been something else entirely. A man of vision, of wealth, of caution. Together, we had built something real. And together, we had agreed to keep it secret. Our modest apartment? A decoy. Our old car? A choice. Our simple clothes and small habits? A strategy. And today, standing in the cold shadow of betrayal, I understood why we had lived that way. It had been prophetic. Because even your own blood can turn on you when they think you're worth something. My hand reached inside my worn black purse, 5 years old, faded leather, scuffed corners, and I pulled out my cell phone. I dialed a number I hadn't used in over a year. Not because I'd forgotten it, but because I had prayed I'd never need it again. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "Carlos." "It's Aurora," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "I need you to come to the Royal Oaks ballroom. Bring the documents." A pause. "Are you sure, Mrs. Hughes?" he asked. "Once we do this, there's no turning back." I turned and looked through the doorway. Juliet was laughing with her bridesmaids now. Ethan stood beside her like a stranger, already wrapped in the fantasy of their new life. "I'm completely sure," I replied. 30 minutes. No more." I hung up, and walked toward my car with steps that felt heavier and more deliberate than they had in years. I could feel my heartbeat settling into something cold and certain. For the first time in decades, I was ready to drop the mask. For the first time, they were going to meet the real Aurora Hughes. And when they did, when their perfect little scheme collided with the truth I had buried beneath discount sweaters and chipped coffee mugs, they would finally understand the difference between meekness and mercy. 30 minutes. That's all the time they had left to live in their illusion. 30 minutes before the reckoning began. The rain tapped gently on the windshield as I sat in my car outside the ballroom, still shaking from the slap, from the betrayal, from the humiliating silence of my own son. But as my eyes settled on the streetlights reflecting off the pavement, I didn't cry. Instead, I remembered. 2.5 years ago, Ethan had walked into my apartment with a sheepish smile and nerves jangling in his fingers. "Mom, I want you to meet someone very special," he had said, glancing behind him at a woman who didn't even wait to be introduced before letting her gaze sweep through my living room like an appraiser. Juliet. Everything about her was curated from the flawless bob that framed her face to the designer handbag dangling off her wrist like a trophy. But it wasn't her outfit that gave me pause. It was her eyes. They weren't curious. They were calculating. She had smiled at me and said, "Oh, how cozy," when she saw my second-hand couch and threadbare curtains. Cozy. The tone wasn't complimentary. It was pitiful. Ethan didn't notice, of course. He was too busy beaming. Love had dulled his instincts, but mine sharpened that day like a blade. The dinner was strained. Juliet picked at the chicken I had marinated for hours and asked about my widow's pension as if it were small talk. "Must be tough getting by on so little money," she had said, her expression tight with performative concern. What she didn't know, what no one outside my closest circle knew, was that Robert and I had spent 40 years building quiet wealth and even quieter influence. We chose a simple life not because we had to, but because we understood how dangerous it was to be visibly rich. Juliet had no idea she was sitting in the middle of a meticulously designed decoy. In the weeks that followed, I watched, I listened, and every single visit revealed another crack in her perfect facade. She always commented on the apartment's potential, made remarks about how I deserved better at my age, but her eyes never left the panoramic view from my balcony. The building was in one of the most desirable areas of the city, an inheritance of location that couldn't be replicated. One afternoon, while Ethan was in the bathroom, I stood quietly just outside the kitchen doorway and heard her whisper into her phone. "Yes, Mom. His mom's place is in the expensive part of town. I think if we keep pressing, we can get her to move out. She's old. She'll probably thank us for the help." Her voice was syrupy, casual, like she was discussing the weather, but every word sliced through me like glass. That was the day I stopped being uncertain. That was the day I began preparing. From then on, every family dinner, every visit, every friendly suggestion Juliet made about senior communities or how difficult it must be to live alone became part of the performance. She played the concerned daughter-in-law, full of helpful advice. I played the vulnerable old woman, eyes cloudy with confusion, slow to respond. But behind that performance, I was building something stronger than resistance. I was building a case. It was a game of psychological chess, and both of us thought we were winning, but she had no idea who she was really playing with. 3 months before the wedding, the pressure escalated. First came the real estate brochures left carelessly on my coffee table. "I just saw this and thought of you," she would say with a gleaming smile. "They have 24-hour medical support and group cooking classes. Isn't that cute?" Then came the guilt tactics. "You wouldn't want to be a burden on Ethan once we have children, right? We'll need more space, and your apartment is just sitting there." Even Ethan, my sweet, naive Ethan, began parroting her lines. "Mom, maybe she's right. It might be safer for you in a senior community. You could make friends. You'd have more help." More help. As if I were already a failing engine, they were trying to gently roll into the scrapyard. I said nothing, but I remembered everything. Behind the scenes, I had begun consulting my own allies, old friends in real estate, attorneys Robert had trusted, and most importantly, Carlos. When I told him what I suspected, he didn't ask questions. He began running checks, pulling reports, digging beneath the surface. And what he uncovered, chilled me. Juliet and Ethan were drowning in debt. The apartment they rented was 3 months behind on payments. Their wedding was being funded almost entirely by credit. Their cars, leased, their lifestyle? A carefully curated lie built on sand. My apartment was their escape route. I wasn't their beloved mother. I was a means to an end. And as I sat in that car, waiting for Carlos, I realized that Juliet's slap had been her final mistake. Not because it hurt, but because it freed me. The mask had slipped, the gloves were off. Tonight, they would finally learn that the meek little widow wasn't so meek after all. 2 weeks before the wedding, they made their boldest move yet. Juliet showed up at my apartment with Ethan in tow, but this time, they weren't alone. Her parents, Richard and Elaine Dawson, followed close behind, dressed like they were attending a country club fundraiser rather than visiting an aging mother-in-law in a modest apartment. Elaine's perfume filled the room before her voice did sharp, clipped, polished. "Aurora, we want to talk to you about your future," she said, sitting down without waiting to be offered a seat. Richard remained standing, surveying my apartment like a realtor evaluating a distressed property. "At your age," he began, "living alone in such a large place is unnecessary, not to mention dangerous. What if you had a medical emergency? No one would know for days." They weren't here to talk, they were here to take. Ethan sat beside Juliet on the couch, his body stiff, eyes flickering between us. He looked like a man trying not to drown in a sea of decisions he no longer controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was robotic. "Mom, they're right. Juliet and I have talked about this. We think it would be better if you moved to somewhere more appropriate, for your age." I stared at him. "For your age." The words dropped into the room like acid. "And who decides what's appropriate for me?" I asked softly. Elaine didn't miss a beat. "We all want what's best for you, and for Ethan and Juliet. You could live somewhere with more support, more company. It's not about the apartment," she added, her tone smooth. "It's about your well-being." But the slip came moments later. "Of course, your apartment would be the perfect space for the newlyweds to start their life." There it was, the truth, bare and bald and gleaming in the fluorescent kitchen light. Juliet's voice chimed in with its usual syrupy tone. "It's not just about the space. We've looked into some wonderful residences for seniors. They have 24/7 nurses, catered meals, book clubs, movie nights. It would be lovely for you." I smiled so faintly it was almost imperceptible. "And how exactly do you think I'd pay for this lovely new life?" Richard reached into a folder, yes, a folder, and pulled out pre-calculated figures. The residence costs approximately $2,500 a month. With the sale of this apartment, you could cover that easily and still have enough left to help Ethan and Juliet get on their feet. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a transaction. A cold, clinical, rehearsed presentation. They had practiced this. "And Ethan?" He nodded along. "The boy I had raised, the one who used to build forts with bed sheets and whisper secrets to me when he couldn't sleep, was now willing to sign away my life in exchange for a down payment on his." That night, after they left with my quiet refusal echoing in the air, I sat in my favorite chair and cried for the first time in years. Not out of sadness, but for the final death of illusion. I had held on to the fantasy that Ethan was still somewhere inside the man, sitting next to Juliet. That perhaps he was confused, pressured, unsure. But now I knew. He had chosen her. He had chosen greed. I called Carlos immediately. "Prepare everything," I told him. "Bank records, real estate, investment documents, everything. I want to be ready." He didn't ask why. He simply said, "Yes, Mrs. Hughes." Days passed, and I moved like a shadow in my own life, silent, watching, preparing. The apartment, once my refuge, now felt like the eye of a storm, the calm before a reckoning. Then came Juliet's final, unmasked demand. It was just 3 days before the wedding. She arrived alone this time, her eyes bright and unapologetic. "Aura," she said, using my name like a blunt instrument. "You can't keep being so selfish. Ethan and I have sacrificed everything for this wedding. The least you can do is help us with housing." There was no pretense now, no faux concern, just entitlement pure and ugly. Her words barely echoed before I responded. "You've sacrificed everything?" I asked quietly. Tell me, Juliet, what have you sacrificed exactly? She blinked. Her confidence wavered for the briefest second. But I didn't wait for an answer. I stood, walked over to the cabinet where I kept Robert's framed photo, and picked it up. My husband and I built a life together brick by brick. We buried friends, raised a son, lost sleep over bills, over health scares, over taxes. We lived simply not because we were poor, but because we were wise. We protected this family with silence. But now, that silence ends. Juliet opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. Tell Ethan I'll see him at the wedding. She left without another word. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder Carlos had sent me. Property deeds, bank statements, legal authorizations. They thought they were taking advantage of a lonely, aging widow. But they were about to learn what it meant to wake a sleeping lioness. The air in the parking lot was cooler than it had been earlier, the kind of crisp calm that follows a thunderstorm. The ballroom behind me pulsed with warm light and wedding music, oblivious to the storm about to come. I sat in my old sedan, gripping the steering wheel, waiting. Carlos would arrive soon, but before he did, I needed something else. I picked up the phone and called Joseph. Joseph, I said, can you do me a favor? I need the brown folder in the second drawer of my desk. Yes, that one. Can you bring it to the parking lot? Now. Joseph had lived next door to me for over a decade, a retired school principal with a sharp eye and a quiet soul. He'd seen the change in Ethan. He'd noticed Juliet coming and going with that unsettling intensity of someone casing a property, not visiting family. Just a week before, he had knocked on my door, whispering urgently, Aurora, I saw Juliet outside with a man in a suit looked like a real estate agent. They were measuring the perimeter of your apartment. When I stepped out on the balcony, they packed up and left. His voice had carried the tremble of someone realizing that the world wasn't as decent as they once believed. 15 minutes later, Joseph arrived. He handed me the folder through the car window, his eyes heavy with concern. What's going on? It's time they find out who I really am, I said quietly. Inside the folder were decades of secrecy. It was a lifeline disguised as paperwork, the deed to a beach house, a bank statement showing over $5.4 million in an investment account, and the title for an office building downtown that generated over $50,000 a month in rental income. Robert and I had built it all in silence. After his cancer diagnosis, we made a pact, live quietly, stay humble, never let anyone know. Visible wealth attracts leeches, Robert used to say. But invisible wealth, that's power. And now, that power would protect me. The folder also contained proof that I had been financing Ethan's life for years. Monthly transfers totaling $4,500. Payments disguised as bonuses, refunds, gifts. I had paid for everything: his apartment, his wedding, even the car he drove. He thought his life was held together by luck. It was me. It had always been me. Juliet had once laughed at my purse. You've had that thing for years, she'd sneered. Don't you want something nicer? If she only knew that the same woman carrying that scuffed leather bag had been quietly paying her catering bill. I flipped through the documents one more time, my fingers steady now. Every page, every transaction, every signature was a piece of a life they had tried to erase. They believed I was weak because I stayed quiet. They mistook dignity for submission. But the truth was, I had always been watching, recording, remembering. I had waited until they crossed the line they could never return from. And they had. The slap was not what changed everything. It only confirmed what I already knew. They didn't just want my apartment, they wanted control over me. My freedom, my decisions, my independence. And when they couldn't guilt me into submission, they moved to humiliate me. But now, the humiliation would be theirs. Headlights turned into the lot, and I recognized Carlos's car instantly, punctual as always, meticulous, discreet. He parked beside me and stepped out with a briefcase. He opened it under the street lamp and handed me 3 documents, everything you asked for. The first, immediate suspension of all financial support in Ethan's name. The second, cancellation of the rent guarantee on his current apartment. The third, cancellation of the wedding payment scheduled to go through the next morning. You can still change your mind, Carlos said gently. I shook my head. If I do nothing, they win. Not just the apartment, but the belief that they were right to treat me this way. Carlos gave a small nod. Then it's time. We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the distant music floating out from the ballroom windows. Then, without a word, we began walking toward the building, two shadows moving toward the fire, carrying truth in a leather folder. In less than 10 minutes, the wedding celebration would become a reckoning. And the poor old woman they had slapped, mocked, and dismissed would finally speak. The ballroom doors loomed ahead like the gates of a cathedral, ornate, polished, and trembling slightly from the bass of the music pulsing behind them. I felt Carlos pause beside me, his fingers gripping the folder tightly. Once we open that door, it doesn't close the same way again, he said. I'm not here to close a door, I replied. I'm here to walk through it with my name, my truth, and my dignity intact. He nodded, and together we stepped inside. The music screeched to a halt the moment we entered. All heads turned, conversations froze mid-sentence. Champagne flutes halted in mid-air. There was a vacuum in the room, as if everyone was waiting for a cue, and what they saw was not what they expected. Me, in my worn black coat. Carlos in a crisp tailored suit, holding legal documents. Juliet, standing under a cascading flower arch, turned and saw me. Her perfect bridal mask cracked. "What are you doing here, Aurora?" she snapped, her voice slicing through the stillness like a whip. "Wasn't your little tantrum enough for one evening?" She moved toward me in her white dress, dragging lace and anger behind her like a storm cloud. Ethan followed, his expression unsure but already paling. Carlos stepped forward, calm and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a voice trained for courtrooms, not dance floors. "I apologize for the interruption, but I represent Mrs. Aurora Hughes and have urgent legal matters to present to Mr. Ethan Hughes and Mrs. Juliet Dawson." A ripple of tension swept through the guests. Phones were subtly raised, eyes widened. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice tight, strained. "What's going on?" Carlos opened the folder. "Mr. Hughes," he said, "you are hereby notified that all financial transfers previously made in your name by Mrs. Aurora Hughes have been terminated effective immediately. This includes rent payments, credit card settlements, car insurance, and discretionary deposits totaling $4,500 per month." Ethan blinked. "I what? What are you talking about?" Juliet was faster. "That's a lie," she snapped. "She's a widow on a pension. She lives in a shoebox and drives a clunker. She doesn't have a cent." Carlos turned to her with impeccable calm. "Mrs. Dawson, I assure you, that is false, and you will see just how false it is in a moment." He produced another sheet. "The payment guarantee for this wedding ballroom, catering, music, photography was personally backed by Mrs. Hughes. That guarantee has been rescinded. The venue has been notified." Gasps, actual audible gasps echoed around the room. The ballroom manager appeared at the edge of the dance floor, his face red and furious, already holding paperwork. Juliet's eyes widened with real fear now. "You can't do this," she shouted. "You can't ruin our wedding over some stupid grudge." Carlos remained silent. He simply turned to me. I stepped forward, my voice even. "Juliet," I said, "what ruined your wedding wasn't me. It was the greed, the deceit, and the arrogance you wore better than that dress." She flinched as though slapped. I turned to Ethan. "And you," I said, the weight of every sleepless night pressing behind my ribs. "Let it happen. You stood by while your wife humiliated me. You plotted to take my home. You let them plan a legal ambush to strip me of my rights." Ethan was pale now, his lips parted but empty of sound. "This entire celebration," I continued, "was paid for by the woman you discarded like an unwanted guest. The champagne, the flowers, the violin quartet, all of it. Funded by the mother you tried to push into a retirement home." One guest, a woman in a green dress, whispered loudly to her husband, "Is that true? Oh my God, is that true?" It was enough to start the shift. The room changed. The stares weren't pitying anymore, they were horrified. They weren't judging me, they were judging them. Carlos pulled out the final document. "Mrs. Hughes has amended her will," he said, loud and clear. "All previously designated assets for Mr. Ethan Hughes have been redirected to charitable organizations that serve senior citizens at risk of family abuse." There was a collective intake of breath. Juliet collapsed into a chair. "Number. No, no, no. This isn't happening," she sobbed. "You can't just cut us off like that." "You didn't just lose an inheritance," I said, stepping closer. "You lost a person who loved you. You lost the mother who paid for your wedding dress, your rent, your car, your designer perfume, and the very chair you're crying in right now." Ethan fell to his knees in front of me. "Mom, please," he whispered. "I didn't know it would go this far." I bent slightly so our eyes were level. "That's the problem, Ethan," I said, my voice cracking, but not breaking. "You never thought it could." And then, in front of 130 stunned guests, I turned and walked away. The woman they thought was weak had never been stronger. And as the doors closed behind me, I didn't look back. 3 days passed. 3 long, quiet, glorious days. My apartment, once haunted by echoes of guilt and disappointment, now breathed peace. The phone rang incessantly, of course. Ethan left 37 messages, each more unhinged than the last. Disbelief, anger, bargaining, begging. Juliet sent 14 text messages, her tone swinging from hysterical fury to saccharine desperation. Her parents even came to my door twice, demanding I fix what I had so irresponsibly destroyed. I didn't answer. I didn't owe them that anymore. Joseph stopped by every morning with coffee and warm pastries. To celebrate the woman who finally stood up for herself, he'd say, raising his cup like a toast. It was the most comforting ritual I had known in years. But peace, I had learned, is a temporary visitor when money and power are at stake. Carlos arrived that morning, his face serious. I invited him to the balcony. He didn't waste time. "Mrs. Hughes," he began. "Ethan filed a preliminary petition yesterday afternoon." I felt my stomach tighten. A petition for what? He opened his briefcase and placed a stack of documents on the table between us. "He's formally requested a court evaluation of your mental competency." It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "On what grounds?" Carlos tapped a paper. "He's citing irrational financial behavior and emotional instability witnessed publicly by over 100 people. He's also submitted sworn statements from guests at the wedding, claiming you acted erratically." I felt the familiar sting behind my eyes, but it didn't spill. "Not this time. They want to declare me incompetent," I said flatly. Carlos nodded. "Yes, and if the court agrees, they can request control of your assets." The betrayal had deepened. They hadn't just tried to rob me of my home, they were now trying to take my very autonomy, my identity. That same morning, Joseph, Lucy, and Amelia arrived together, faces grim, holding their own folder. "I think we need to talk," Lucy said softly, placing the folder next to Carlos's. Over the last 3 days, Lucy had done her own investigating. Her hands trembled as she opened the file. "Juliet has been planting rumors," she began. "She told several of your neighbors that you've been forgetting things, that you've been acting erratically. She's visited your doctor's office and tried to access your medical history by claiming to be your caretaker." Amelia added, "She's been researching guardianship laws for over 6 months. She had planned this long before the slap, long before the wedding." Joseph leaned forward, his voice low. "And there's something else. The night you left the ballroom, I saw Juliet outside, screaming into her phone. She kept saying, 'The old woman ruined Plan A, but we still have Plan B.'" "Plan B?" I asked, my voice hollow. Lucy gripped my hand. "They're trying to build a legal case against you, Aurora. They want to paint you as delusional and dangerous." I stared down at the table, at the legal documents, at the evidence of their campaign. The slap was never the beginning. It was the culmination. I stood up slowly and walked to my desk. From the bottom drawer, I retrieved a folder I had been preparing quietly since the day I asked Carlos to help me. Inside were my own weapons, copies of the financial transfers I had made to Ethan, documentation of my regular therapy sessions, a letter from my physician certifying my mental health, and photographs taken by Joseph of Juliet's appraiser scoping my apartment. And one final item, a photograph of my cheek the night of the wedding, visibly swollen from the slap. That, too, had been documented and verified by my doctor. "I hoped it wouldn't come to this," I said, laying the folder on top of Carlos's. "But if they want war, they're going to get it, and they'll learn that I didn't survive 70 years of life just to be erased by a pair of spoiled children." Carlos leaned back and smiled, for the first time that day. "You're not fighting this alone, Mrs. Hughes." Outside, the morning sun spilled across the city like a quiet promise. They thought they could silence me, but I was just beginning to speak. 6 months after the night that divided my life into a before and an after, I sat beneath the glowing lights of the most watched talk show in the country, waiting to share my story with millions. They called it Stories of a Lifetime, but what I was about to reveal wasn't just a story. It was a warning, a reckoning, a rising. Catherine Diaz, the respected journalist sitting across from me, leaned in with a warm smile. "Mrs. Hughes, the courage you showed has inspired an entire movement. How does it feel to have become a national symbol for elder dignity?" I smiled back, not with pride, but with a quiet knowing. "I didn't plan to become anything more than a mother who had enough," I said. "But when enough becomes too much, even the quietest woman finds her voice." The interview lasted 45 minutes. I told them everything: the slap, the betrayal, the conspiracy to declare me incompetent, the viral videos, the legal war, the heartbreaking silence that followed. Ethan never reached out, not after the legal defeat, not after the headlines. He chose the easier path: resentment over reflection. Juliet, however, tried several times. Her final message arrived 2 weeks before the interview. "Aurora, I'm pregnant. Ethan is sick with stress. We're broke. You're going to be a grandmother. Don't punish your grandchild for our mistakes." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I had finally learned what I deserved. Love without exploitation. Respect without conditions. Family without fear. When Catherine asked if I had a message for my son, I looked directly into the camera. "Ethan," I said, "if you're watching this, I want you to know I still love you. That love didn't vanish. When you betrayed me, it fractured, it bruised, but it still exists." A pause. "But love without boundaries isn't love. It's martyrdom. I will always be your mother, but I will never again be your victim." The show ended with a standing ovation from the studio audience. Even the crew had tears in their eyes. Carlos, seated beside me, nodded with pride. Lucy, Amelia, and Joseph clapped from the front row, my chosen family. Later that week, I received over 2,000 letters, strangers telling me I had given them permission to say no, to set boundaries, to reclaim their names. In the 2 years since the slap, my life has transformed in ways I never imagined. I founded the Aurora Hughes Foundation for the protection of seniors, using the very money Ethan once tried to take from me. We've helped more than 400 older adults regain control over their lives through legal aid, emotional support, and education. Joseph now serves as our vice president. Lucy heads our education department. Carlos handles our accounts and legal strategy. The woman who once watered plants to quiet her anxiety now testifies before Congress to strengthen protections against elder exploitation. The apartment Juliet tried to steal? It's now the heart of our operations, walls lined with thank you letters, photos of healed families, and awards I never sought but humbly accepted. As for Ethan, he tried to reach out 3 times in 2 years, always when he needed something, never with an apology. The last time, he said, "Mom, your pride is more important than your grandson?" And I replied, "My dignity is exactly as important as my grandson, and I pray one day he learns that better than you did." Juliet left him shortly after, took the baby, took half of what little they had. Ethan is now a cautionary tale in a story I never wanted to write but did. For every Oliver born into a family poisoned by greed, I now fight harder to break the cycle. Because the true inheritance I want to leave isn't money. It's courage. The courage to say no, to walk away, to live without shame. I spend my mornings mentoring survivors, my afternoons organizing community gardens and workshops, my evenings writing letters to people like Margaret, who recently sent me a photo of herself next to a new car she bought after her son tried to sell the last one behind her back. "You taught me," she wrote, "that self-love isn't selfishness, it's survival." And at night, when the city quiets and the air cools, I sit on my balcony, the same one Juliet once coveted, and smile. Not because I won, but because I lived, because I rose, because I reclaimed every piece of myself they tried to take. When people ask if I regret that night in the ballroom, I always say the same thing. That wasn't the night I lost my family. It was the night I found myself. And that, I tell them, is the beginning of everything.